Like it or not, migration is a huge part of the world that we live in here today. In fact, it's probably gotten to the point that for a lot of you that are looking at this video here right now, you've probably not really necessarily thought of it, but have you ever wondered why people migrate to different parts of the world? Well, migration is one of the most important political issues in our society today. But the migration of populations, it's not only something that is a very complicated and nuanced topic with all the misinformation and AI slop that you see out everywhere. It is also exhausting to try to understand and figure out, especially with as complicated as it can get around the world. So, what it is that we're going to be doing here and discussing on the history of everything is exactly that. Not only because migration of populations is something that does affect communities that they move to, but also just in general as a topic, it is something that is very interesting. Though I will say this, especially considering what it is that I'm known for, this is probably going to be a first in how brief we're going to be going into varying different topics about this. Genuinely, all of you should be very impressed that I'm not going on a 30-hour rant about one particular tribe moving to a different location, because I know what I'm famous for. Ah, yes, and simultaneously, I also did want to say that if you want to support my channel, considering how many topics on here have a tendency to get demonetized or punished by YouTube's algorithm, you must support me by checking out my very sweet merch, featuring the new one that we have here, Gladbod, which has a historically accurate gladiator body. Something that I apparently have and am actually trying to get rid of a little bit. And besides that, if you want to go on an adventure with me, you can do so by joining us on one of our group trips. Currently, we have a couple spots that are available to China, as well as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. So we have a Baltic Christmas trip, and then we have a Chinese Great Wall adventure. So we're going to be having an absolute blast at the end of this year of 2026, going into 2027. All of that is linked down in the description below. So thank you. But as always, in order to be able to talk about this, we have to zoom out for some crucial context first. To begin, my friends, in order to be able to talk about the migrations of people, we need to discuss diaspora. Now, what does that word even mean, you may wonder? You might have heard it tossed around and not exactly known its meaning, but it's really simple, actually. It comes from a Greek word essentially meaning to scatter or to sow, and it was first used in order to describe the dislocation and the resettling of the Jews after the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC. Of course, there were other peoples that this also could classify, but really up until the 1960s, when the word was used, it was almost always in reference to the migration of Jewish populations around the world. But by this point in time, the word diaspora can be used to refer to any large migration of a group of people for various reasons. In recent years, the notion of diaspora is also something that has moved from religious migration and cultural studies to the policy realm as well. Diasporas have come to be seen as central in relation to a range of different issues, from struggles for political recognition of nation states over identity politics to transnational mobilization of development and reconstruction progress. There is any number of kinds of things that can be done for this. And so, over time, varying different countries have adopted varying different ways of referring to their diasporas, and there are a variety of existing types of diaspora population. You have nationals abroad, permanent immigrants, citizens of X origin living abroad, non-resident of X origin, persons of X origin, expatriates, transnational citizens, etc., etc., etc. There's any number of ways that you could probably classify it. But these terms are used to cover multiple realities that differ from country to country. People settled in a host country on a permanent basis, labor migrants that are based abroad for a period of time, dual citizens, ethnic diasporas, citizens of a host country, or second generation groups. There is, again, an infinite number of ways that we could really break this down. So today, my friends, what it is that we're going to be talking about is some of the more unique diasporas along with the famous. These are the movements of populations that not only make sense, but also, as you're going to see over the course of this, sometimes they just really don't seem to make any sense at all. And that makes them so incredibly fascinating to study. With that, we're going to go ahead and get started. Now, if you're simply curious about which countries have the largest diaspora populations, I'll go ahead and get that one out of the way right now because it's not actually the point of this video. The top 6 countries, according to global diaspora populations, are currently the ones that you'll typically find atop the list in any given year with very few exceptions. They are, in order, India with 18 million, Mexico with 12 million, China with 11 million, Russia with 10 million, Syria with 8 million, and Bangladesh with 7.8 million. And honestly, when I'm going and talking about this, explaining the reasons why so many people leave those countries is pretty simple to explain for each one. Like Indians tend to move abroad to get university educations and for job opportunities. Mexico's migrants are typically seeking better economic and job opportunities or to escape violence. Chinese move abroad for perhaps the most varied reasons out of all the top six, but they also send a large amount of their people abroad for education purposes. You have Russia, which typically ends up on this list for economic reasons, but in the last few years, more and more Russians are leaving their homeland to avoid dying in Putin's war against Ukraine, because that has been happening a lot. Syria is the most ravaged and war torn country out of this list, and over a decade of civil war would turn their country into basically a level from Call of Duty game that has caused it to hemorrhage its population for, again, at least the last decade. And from there, last but not least, we have Bangladesh, which might be a bit of a surprise, but it really makes sense when you realize that many of the mega projects that we've talked about here in the Middle East from oil rich countries, those have been built off the backbreaking labor of millions of Bangladeshi migrants. So there you go. That's your top six list. But the reason for this video in the first place are those diaspora populations that stop and make you go, okay, hold on, that's pretty crazy. Why does that even exist? And so those are the diasporas that we're going to be primarily talking about here today. With that all being said, we're going to go ahead and start with the basic one that a lot of people are probably aware of, but not necessarily know just how big it actually is. We're going to start with the largest and the most known diaspora population out of any of this list, Ireland. As I'm sure many people are aware, Ireland suffered a massive famine caused by the British and the failure of a potato crop in a brutal 4-year period from 1845 to 1849. This would cause huge rates of Irish people fleeing to other countries for some semblance of hope. And after the first wave of Irish migrants left their homeland, they would send word back home about the places that offered the most opportunity to be able to go and rebuild their lives. It is estimated that around 4.5 million Irish immigrants moved to America between 1820 and 1930. And the rush of people during the famine was just a part of this huge movement of people. This led to the amount of people of Irish descent being larger in the United States than it is in the whole island of Ireland. And the difference between the population totals is honestly something that's not even close. By this point, there are around 34.7 million Americans who identify as Irish, at least to some degree, and the population of the entire island of Ireland is only around 6.6 million. The Republic of Ireland has 4.75 million, and Northern Ireland has 1.85 million. Yeah, that is a really big difference, and it is actually an even greater difference between the two when you realize that amongst the figure of 6.6 million people that live on the island, there is a significant portion of those people who themselves are immigrants and not born in Ireland. That is actually a crucial factor that we would need to talk about here, or at least talk about in a future video, because there's a lot of problems that are going on right now related to migration and immigration. Topic for another video. Anyway, the American Irish population is so large for a couple of reasons. For one, they've been here for 150 years, which means that they've had a few generations worth of time to add to the population numbers. And then secondly, the Irish formed strong community bonds once they got to America, becoming part of the backbone of American cities like Boston and New York. Once it was considered safe and profitable, they would also typically send for more families to go and immigrate and join them, which happened very commonly in the Irish diaspora. Once they got there, they would stay here and invite even more of their kin. And by this point, it's almost impossible to think of a United States that really didn't have significant contributions and influence of the Irish population that didn't just move there, but grew to call it home. And that really, again, as I said, is all I'm going to be saying on the matter, because we're not going to be going into extensive detail about each and every single one of these, more so of an overview. But moving on, the next couple of countries and their diasporas are going to have a very rare reason for their inclusion here. Their countries simply stopped existing. When the Soviet Union broke apart after Christmas of 1991, it would end the 70-year-old existence of a system that, yeah, while horribly managed, that was also the only way of life that tens of millions of people had really ever known. Some of them would adapt to the change better than others, and they would stay, and others simply had to leave. Armenia, as an example of this, already had a larger diaspora then than all other Soviet countries due to the effects of the horrific Armenian genocide from 1915 to 1923. This massacre most certainly did happen, no matter what Turkey says, and up to 1.5 million Armenians were slaughtered by the Ottomans. During this period of time, the genocide was taking place. More than 60,000 Armenians would flee to the United States. And that wouldn't really be the only place they would go, because you need to remember, Armenia fell into the group of Central Asian countries that was under the rule of the USSR. So by the 1960s, there was nearly 500,000 Armenians in the United States and Canada alone, and there was also more that was in the USSR itself. With the outbreak of civil war in Lebanon in 1975 and the Islamic Revolution of Iran in 1978, this is something that caused Armenians to flee their homeland again en masse. This is shown in the 1980 US Census data that shows that between 1975 and 1980, Iranian Armenians made up 90% of all immigration to the United States. 90%. That is an insane amount, especially considering it's the US with as much migration as the United States gets. But wait, it gets worse. When the Soviet Union collapsed, this caused a terrible energy crisis in Armenia in the early 90s. Without the power to even light their homes or run a refrigerator, around 800,000 Armenians fled their homeland again. Now, many of these moved to Russia, where, yes, the situation was still obviously bad after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but at the very least, they still had power, so things were better there. But after that, the second most traveled to destination by Armenians seeking a new home was again the United States. This is because the US already had established ethnic enclaves of Armenians, and by the year 2020, there was nearly 1 million Armenians in Russia, which makes sense because they were near Armenia already. But what's even more surprising by that same point in time is that over 500,000 Armenians lived in the United States, on the other side of the globe from their homeland. Really, they are some wild numbers, and the Armenians have honestly been through quite a lot, primarily because they were mostly Christian in a part of the world that leans heavily Islamic. Hello, Moonbeam. Yes, you're talking about the migration of people here. This is actually one of the least bad times that you've ever jumped on me, because we're not talking about something immediately horrible necessarily. Either way, as I was saying, by the year 2020, there was over 11 million ethnic Armenians in the world, and less than 3 million of those actually live in Armenia. Yes, it is that big of a deal. Genuinely, my friends, when it is that we're talking about this, when the Soviet Union collapsed, it caused so much chaos around the world outside of the USSR that this whole video could actually just be about those countries alone. But we're not going to do that. We're just going to mention some of them briefly to drive home the point that people fled their home countries by the millions over the course of this time. So, next up here then, in rapid order, we have Bosnia and Herzegovina, which declared independence in 1991 during the fall of communist Yugoslavia, and that saw a bloody ethnic war in the aftermath, which then as a result had 34% of its entire population living abroad in 2020. Along with them, Albania would go and end more than 40 years of communism. Oh my god, you just really like the communist revolutionary and everything going to crap, don't you, Moonbeam? As I said, along with that, Albania would end more than 40 years of communism and international isolation in 1992. Serious financial mismanagement and an ensuing civil war would keep the country in dire straits throughout the 1990s and into the new millennium. So it is then that today, almost a third of the world's Albanian population lives abroad. More Eastern European nations and former Soviet republics among the countries with the largest diasporas in the world are also Moldova, North Macedonia, Croatia, and Kazakhstan. It actually should be noted, though, that Kazakhstan has some of the worst migration numbers in the entire world, yet in the last decade, they've actually instituted a massive program to try and bring people back home, and it seems to kind of be working with numbers actually bouncing back, with more Kazakhs returning home than leaving in recent years. So that is a pretty big deal. But then, along with those countries, you have countries which are currently or have very recently been embroiled in war and conflict. And that is something that is just expected to appear when talking about or analyzing any migration data. Syria, a nation of around 28 million native-born people, now has 8 million of them, or around 30%, living abroad. South Sudan, where a civil war officially ended in 2020, though more crap is still ongoing there, and I'm probably going to talk about, has a diaspora share of 21%. Even though they are not at war, countries that are severely mismanaged by their governments also go and make this list and include Eritrea at 18.5% and Venezuela at 16.6%. There is quite a lot. And besides that, it's not just the mismanaged countries. Another continental Latin American country that has an even bigger diaspora is El Salvador, and their civil war had ended back in 1992, but because of gang violence prevailing everywhere, more than 20% of the nation lives abroad. At least they did until Nayib Bukele launched his war on crime, and that caused both homicide and migration statistics to pretty much completely turn around. I'm actually very curious as to how that is going to end up changing things over the course of the next 10 to 15 years, but really only time will tell. But the biggest diaspora driven by conflict, however, is seen in a non-sovereign territory, as more than 45% of those born in what we would call Palestine currently reside abroad, according to the UN. And, well, honestly, when it is that I'm going and describing things, that's probably all it is that I have to say for this matter because A, my channel's monetization depends on it, and also simultaneously because there is no way I could talk about this without going into a much bigger deep dive because the way that people feel on the internet about it is extremely polarizing, to say the least. I might be underselling it a bit. Anyway, moving on from there, in regions where small countries are common and remoteness is added as another factor, like for example in the Caribbean or Oceania, diaspora is the most widespread related to the percentage of a country's population. Out of all sovereign countries with at least 750,000 inhabitants, Caribbean nation Guyana has the biggest share of its native born population, 36.4% living abroad. Jamaica comes fifth at 28.6%. Now, taking into account independent countries of all sizes, island nations dominate the top ranks, with up to half of their populations having settled in other countries. Polynesia was the region with the highest overall diaspora share in 2020 at 28.7%, followed by the Caribbean at 17.7%. And that is actually something right there that leads us to our next three examples, all of which involve island countries and massive diasporas. Now, the first one that we'd be discussing here is the country of Samoa, which is in and of itself so incredibly interesting. Samoan migration started only after World War II, as did other Polynesian migration. Now, many Samoan migrants would visit places like Auckland, Honolulu, and California cities from the beginning, and that is where they would largely go. But then they started to settle down in these cities and in the adjacent areas. And as the Samoan Islands were divided politically into two, you had Western Samoa and then American Samoa, which is British and American. The migration of the Samoans was extensive on both sides of the Pacific Rim. Today, we find many Samoan communities in West Coast American cities, in Honolulu, in New Zealand, and in Australia. They are all over the place there. The Samoan Islands themselves are divided into two countries, as I said, where you have Western Samoa, which became independent from New Zealand in 1962, and then you have American Samoa, which is a United States territory, so it's not independent. Many Western Samoans went as labor migrants during the 1960s and early 1970s when the New Zealand economy needed more labor because of her industrialization, and Western Samoans needed more cash because their growing money economy actually meant that you needed cash on it, so they would migrate for work. On the other hand, after the U.S. naval unit in Pago Pago was removed and integrated into a base in Hawaii in 1951, American Samoa was nearly forgotten about until heavily subsidized economic development was introduced a decade later. During this period of, we're going to call it insufficient employment, immigration to Hawaii and other continental United States areas was an important economic alternative for many American Samoas, especially for their youth population that basically had no opportunities. After the development of a fishing base and two canning factories in the late 1950s and 1960s, American Samoa would again find itself in economic trouble. This time due to a labor shortage, because remember again, a lot of the population literally just left. It also started to attract Western Samoan and Tongan labor with wages that were several times higher than those in both countries because, go figure, when you're backed by American industrial might, there's going to be a bit more cash. From here, there are many intermarriages between Western and American Samoans, and most families of such unions either live in American Samoa or just in the United States. After the New Zealand government became less open on immigration, emigration from Western Samoa began to flow toward American Samoa and even towards the United States through Samoan relatives who had already migrated. The population of both Samoans by the year 2000 was 159,000 in Western Samoa and 36,000 in American Samoa. And it honestly should be expected that there would be a high population of Samoans in New Zealand as it's the closest large country to the Samoan Islands, which yes, it does. The New Zealand population of Samoans is over 182,000, and they've integrated them so well that some of them hold seats in the New Zealand government. But the country with the largest population of Samoans in the world is the US, despite the fact that from the beginning, American Samoa was only 36,000 people. They have a population of over 205,000, and that figure refers to the immigration from both Samoa and American Samoa because both are trying to go there for better economic opportunities. That number is slightly higher than the entire population of the country itself of Samoa, if you looked at all of that together, which is so interesting, in my opinion. Another fascinating slice of history can be found in the island territory of New Caledonia, which is relatively close by, we will say here. This French-administered territory is a group of islands that is situated east of Australia. In January of 1871, 40 years after the French seized control of Algeria, the Kabyle people, which is a Amazigh ethnic group would go and band together to lead what was at the time the biggest revolt against French occupation in Algerian history. In January of 1871, 40 years after the French would seize control of Algeria, the Kabyle people, which are an Amazigh ethnic group, would band together to lead what was at the time the biggest revolt against French occupation in Algerian history. Now, Kabyle leaders believed it was the opportune moment to strike against the French colonial power because France had just lost a war against Prussia, which had led to the collapse of the French government, and was more vulnerable after its defeat. This revolt would end up spreading rapidly, with 250 different tribes joining the rebels' ranks. But things wouldn't exactly work out. The French authorities would respond with more brutality than expected, destroying entire villages and killing tens of thousands of people, both rebels and civilians alike. It was a harsh crackdown. And after years of fighting, the revolt was definitively quashed in 1872. The French authorities would end up seizing over 450,000 hectares of land that it would go and distribute to French settlers, and would quickly put in place trials to prosecute anyone who had rebelled against the French state. Over 2,000 insurgents, among them the leaders of the revolt, faced trial in the city of Constantine, where they were presented not as just anti-colonial leaders, but as petty criminals. Now, at this point, you're probably wondering, why the hell are we talking about this? This is supposed to be about New Caledonia in the middle of Oceania. Why are we talking about North Africa with Algeria and the French? Well, here's the thing. At this trial, because most of the men hailed from noble families and they were leaders of their respective tribes, the French were kind of wary of sentencing them to death because that could just create even greater instability at home, where it is that, this level of brutality means that they could probably have their relatives rise up in revenge against us. We don't want that. So instead, they decide to exile the men to the furthest place imaginable, New Caledonia. I know, history is just weird sometimes, and I absolutely love it. Anyway, when the men would go and land on New Caledonia shores, they were not allowed to practice Islam, they had to adopt Christian names, and they were forced to marry exiled French women or daughters of French exiles. The colonial administration was hoping that through these marriages, they would create more Christian families that could conform to their idea of settlers. Now, that seems like a okay-ish idea, but the reverse actually happened. French women would generally take on Algerian traditions and kept alive their heritage, learning how to cook Algerian food and teaching it to the following generations. Now, these families would cultivate date palm trees as they did back in Algeria. They gave their children Muslim names in spite of the prohibition to do so by the colonial administration. In 1936, when that ban was finally lifted, many would be able to use their Arab names publicly. Now, this is absolutely fascinating, it really is, but also at the same time, there's something else that is going on here that is a bit strange. See, at first, many Algerian men had no real choice when they were there but to help French authorities to suppress revolts by the local Kanak, the indigenous Melanesian inhabitants of New Caledonia. This being in order to gain back their freedom and actually be given lives as proper settlers. But over time, that participation was not simply something that was forced as like forced conscripts. In some cases, it was completely voluntary, and people would go in order to be able to better their lives. The descendants, who were assimilated into French settler society, played a key role in the repressive apparatus of the colonial state. It was an Algerian prisoner who had actually killed the Kanak chief, Bouet Noel Potiba, an important figure of the 1917 Kanak revolt. Algerian prisoners would go and settle on lands captured by French authorities in the aftermath of the indigenous insurrections. And this alliance, both forced and later voluntary, with the French colonial authorities meant that for most of their history in New Caledonia, these descendants were not seen as victims of some colonial force, but instead just another part of the colonial force, their helping hand. Which is true. It is true. That is true, yes, but it's more complicated than that. History is just generally like that sometimes. They did lose some things due to this forced cultural exchange, like their original language, with their descendants largely speaking French or local dialects. What they created instead was a fusion of Algerian, French, and New Caledonian culture and customs that became uniquely their own. And so by now, at this point in time, there's over 25,000 Algerians living in New Caledonia, and it's probably one of the more unique instances of migration that has been found throughout history. Genuinely fascinating stuff. After that then, next we move on to the island nation of Malta. Now, more Maltese descendants now live abroad than on the island, which should be expected considering how small it is, with the largest communities being in Canada, the UK, and Australia. Immigration would begin in the 19th century, with many Maltese actually moving to Egypt, primarily either Cairo or Alexandria, for work, which was something that was driven by British economic and military activities. Maltese communities in North Africa would go and dwindle over time, with most relocating to France, the UK, and Australia as independence movements would emerge in the region. The economic downturn following World War I, especially in the dockyard sector, would then spur further migration. It is during this time, then, or the interwar years that would follow, that would see approximately 15,000 Maltese nationals move to the US, with Detroit actually being a key destination. Large scale immigration would truly take off after World War II, with many Maltese leaving for English speaking allied countries such as Australia, Canada, the UK, US, all in search of better opportunities. And so, for the first 3 quarters of the 20th century, it's kind of wild. Malta was constantly under economic stress, something that was really only relieved during the actual years where everyone was at war. Migration was considered to be the only way to actually fix the situation, and also as a safety valve for the country. This was especially the case in the immediate post war periods of the 1920s and again in the 1950s and 60s. The Maltese newspapers were very vocal on this point, and it was this very public discussion of emigrating away from the homeland that led to such large populations of Maltese in other countries. It was really only by the mid 1970s that these pressures were eased and the net migration loss came to an end. As after 1975, the watershed year, more migrants would return than actually left the island, which is a pretty big deal. But I mean, it really goes to show that for the first 3 quarters of the century, migration is something that helps Malta to maintain a somewhat acceptable standard of living through the control of its own population size. And it's really interesting to note that between that, like the end of World War II and the 1980s, the population of Malta basically remained static at around 300,000 people. That's it. It just stayed constantly the same as like a valve that is steadily being released to let out a number of people to ease the pressure and then sealing up again. Only afterwards did it start to rise, and it reached the current level now of 400,000. By today, there are nearly 200,000 Maltese people in Australia alone. The UK is home to another 106,000, Canada 105,000. Their mother language, Maltese, was in danger of dying out abroad, but actually recently there have been efforts that have brought back foreign-born Maltese closer to their first language in order to be able to keep the language alive. It really is something that is so incredibly interesting. But another surprising entry on this list of countries that we chose for this video is Japan. Now, weird thing, but if I asked you where the highest population of Japanese people is outside of Japan, where do you think that it would be? Many people would probably think, oh, it's a country that is close to Japan. No, no, just go ahead. Go ahead and guess. I'll let you probably put something in the comments section. Did you guess Brazil? Some of you might have, but a lot of you didn't, I'm sure, if you didn't know. Yes, the highest population of Japanese people outside of their home country is in Brazil, believe it or not. Allow me to explain this. Basically, the way that this went down is that in 1907, the Brazilian and the Japanese government signed a treaty of permitting Japanese migration to Brazil. This was due in part to the decrease in the Italian immigration to Brazil and a new labor shortage on the coffee plantations. Also, Japanese immigration to the United States had been barred by the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907. The first Japanese immigrants, around 781 people and mostly farmers, would come to Brazil in 1908 on the Kasatomaru, and in the first 7 years, 3,434 more Japanese families would arrive, totaling around just under 15,000 people. The beginning of World War I in 1914 would then start a boom in Japanese migration to Brazil, as between 1917 and 1940, over 164,000 Japanese people came to Brazil, with 90% of them going to São Paulo. This being where most of the coffee plantations were actually located, so that is kind of something that makes sense. It worked hand in hand. As I kind of explained here, originally they mostly worked in agriculture, and they formed mostly closed-off communities, trying their best not to lose their Japanese culture through assimilation. This was important for them, but at the same time, they also heavily focused on education of their children from the very start. In 1958, Japanese descendants already represented 21% of Brazilians with an education above secondary level. That is how incredibly specific and educated they became. In 1977, Japanese Brazilians, who made up only 2.5% of the population of Sao Paulo, added up to the 13% of those who were approved at the University of Sao Paulo. 16% of those who were admitted to the Technological Institute of Aeronautics, the ITA, and 12% of those that were selected at the Getulio Vargas Foundation, or FGV. If you name a higher education field or something technical, chances are the Japanese were going into it and dominating relative to the size of their population. According to a 1995 research paper conducted by Datafola, 53% of adult Japanese Brazilians had a college education. Compared to only 9% of Brazilians in general, that is insane. According to a 2009 survey that was carried out with the data from the University of São Paulo, even though the Japanese descendants were only like 1.2 of the population of the city at this point, instead of the 2.5 they were, they made up less than 4% of those who were enrolled in the entrance exams. They were still around 15% of those that were actually approved to go into school. Like the numbers are so incredibly lopsided. A 2017 survey would reveal that Brazilians of Japanese descent are the wealthiest group in Brazil. The survey would conclude that, by far, Brazilians with a Japanese surname are the ones who earn the most of any Brazilian ethnic group on average. And that is just absolutely insane. And so you may be wondering at this time, okay, hold on, but they're Japanese Brazilians. Were they able to do what it is they'd set out from the beginning and maintain their own identity? Were they able to isolate themselves and stay Japanese? And the answer is kind of, actually. By 1987, most Japanese Brazilians were still of full Japanese descent. Only 28% had some non Japanese ancestry or some second, like non Japanese ancestry. Only 6% of second generation Japanese Brazilians, children, were mixed race. That's it, which is not something that you would normally expect from a population going in. Today, Japanese Brazilians make up around 1% of the entire Brazilian population, and from that, have a lopsided economic impact. It's insane. But guess what? They are not necessarily the only one. The Japanese first made diplomatic relations with South Americans in 1873, though, and it wasn't with the Brazilians. It was actually with the Peruvians. Today, Peru has the second largest population of Japanese outside of Japan. And their story is actually quite similar to that of the Japanese Brazilians, except in Peru, they're even less likely to move back home once they reach Peru. With the onset of the global recession in 2008, among the expatriate communities in Japan, Peruvians accounted for the smallest share of those who returned to their homelands. They still hold ties with their homeland, though, and Peruvians in Japan came together after the March 2011 earthquake and tsunami to raise money and provide for new fishing boats for a small town that had nearly been wiped off the map called Minamisanriku. Japanese Peruvians made such an impact on their new home that they eventually even got representation in Peruvian government. In 1991, Alberto Fujimori became the first Japanese Peruvian to become president of Peru. That happened. It's just genuinely so incredibly fascinating and interesting. And I know I've been saying that a lot over the course of this episode, but that's because we're talking about so many different types of things that are all actually fascinating. And I guess here, at the end, we're going to have to conclude with the country and diaspora population that actually inspired this video in the first place and got us looking at it. Currently, there are around 5 million Lebanese people living in Lebanon. And yet, despite that, worldwide, there's up to 14 million Lebanese people. The largest portion of this diaspora, mostly fleeing from the effects of war, terrorism, and economic instability, as you would expect, also, like the Japanese, ended up in Brazil, where there are currently 7 million. After that, you have Argentina, that have around 3 million Lebanese. Now, how did this happen, you may wonder? Well, we're going to need to dive into this a little bit. So, the Lebanese diaspora in South America was something that was formed in the last decades of the 19th century, and in the first of the 20th century. It was at the beginning of the end of the Ottoman Empire, along with the Tanzimat reform, segregation, and exclusion towards Christians, that really started the waves of immigration towards South America in search of a better life. Many Lebanese intellectuals who could not publish in the old Arab world would find an outlet of freedom and expression in South America, where they didn't face nearly the same repercussions. Now, the reasons for immigrating to South America were the large Catholic population. Then, just as in today, Christians are actually the majority in the continent, making it very easy for Lebanese people who were mainly Maronites to actually find their place, with Maronite being a variation of Christian. As civil wars and conflicts would subside, there was a greater need for wealth and skilled working people. And as it turned out, South America was a perfect hub for the diaspora to go and create flourishing communities. During the Lebanese Civil War, more Lebanese would choose to move to South America, creating a new future among the existing Lebanese community that was there. In South America in total, there's around 15 million people of Lebanese descent, with around half of them, as I said, being in Brazil. And this population total means that the Lebanese who settled in Brazil multiplied their numbers by 70 times in less than a century, which is kind of insane. Despite being estimated at less than 4% of the population of the country, descendants of Lebanese immigrants actually occupy 10% of the parliament seats in 2014 in Brazil and 8% in 2015. Most Lebanese immigrants in Brazil have worked as traders who sell textiles and clothes and open new markets. From here, they became very well integrated into Brazilian society, allowing for greater political roles. And that, well, that, my friends, is really all that we can then say here on the matter. I hope you enjoyed this little demographic roundup. The ways in which populations end up moving from one place to another and then thriving or perhaps not thriving, depending on the scenario, could be really interesting and fascinating. And we just wanted to share a bit of that with you because I do actually plan on doing dedicated deep dives to different historical demographic shifts that we are seeing now. Because migration is a topic all around the world that people are they feel very strongly about, to say the least, as I said from the beginning. But we're going to get into that at a later time. That is all it for now. Please go and check us out on Patreon here. You can buy my merch, which actually, I do realize I was wearing katana. I was supposed to wear another shirt before this, but you can buy my merch. You can check that out if you want. You can also join me on any of my trips that I am leading here to go to both the Christmas markets in the Baltic and also to China this next year, which we are going to be going and doing. So, yeah, I will, with that, see you all here next time. Bye, my friends. Thank you very much for watching.